Sometimes we have trouble trying to understand such words as humility. We have very negative concepts of terms implying gentleness or lack of aggressive attitudes. Very often, however, these quiet words are stronger than the more powerful phrases which we more generally admire. I think humility is a very important word because of its protection of our own best interest. In this modern way of life, we must either defend constantly our assumptions of knowledge or power or skill, or else we can take a quiet attitude which does not make such defense necessary. Our people today are a very defensive group. We are all trying to prove that we are something, not so much by what we do as by what we say. We wish to be appreciated. We wish to be recognized. We would like to have a reputation for judgment or ability, discrimination. Yet the moment we assume that we possess these attributes and try to defend them, we enter into a circle of protective mechanisms may prove very discouraging and depleting. We always must face certain values and come back to them again and again. We have a right to be proud of what we know. We also have a right and a need to be humble about what we do not know. And as we begin to analyze the comparative values, we must ultimately recognize the fact that there is much more that we do not know than that we can say we do know. We have very little foundation, therefore, in ourselves or in facts for an arrogant attitude toward life. We have very little justification for attempting to impose our own opinions upon others. We have a right to communicate, to share, but scarcely to force or to press unduly. If, therefore, we take an attitude of gentleness, recognizing the weakness of our own position, we are frequently saved a great deal of embarrassment and taken off of the defensive, a position that is not good for us. Humility is not a synonym of weakness. It is a consequence of self-recognition of the inevitable deficiencies of personal knowledge, or personal understanding, or personal attainment. It is not wrong for us to admit that we are wrong. It is far worse as a habit to try to press forward with wrongness, because when we so act, we only further reveal our own ineptitudes and perhaps even convince ourselves of the rightness of our own mistaken attitudes. The person who is always right is nearly always in trouble. We are simply not that well informed. And while we are always right, we are in such a defensive position that we can seldom learn. The person who lacks humility is a bad student. He is so sure of so many things that he is not receptive to self-improvement. As a result of not being receptive, the true foundations of knowledge within himself are not strengthened. The person who lacks humility also bears testimony to lack of self-discipline. And in this modern world in which we live, we are falling upon evil times. We are gradually removing from society and family the power and right to discipline. And in this situation, only one course remains, because man must be disciplined. Either he must be disciplined by others, or he must be self-disciplined. Where both of these procedures fail, we are in serious trouble. We cannot live a socialized existence unless we impose upon ourselves certain patterns and policies of conduct. The person who has a natural gentleness or a natural humility will recognize his own faults and impose discipline upon himself. One of a more arrogant mind will not do so, and as a result is much more inclined to an undisciplined and antisocial existence. Now, there is an egoism in us that resents, in some cases, an attitude of modesty. We feel that it is becoming to others, but that we are different, and that we have the right to show ourselves to the greatest and most aggressive advantage. Actually, a kind of modesty is a constant protection. The individual who is not aggressive saves energy, saves life, and frequently becomes an observer and a spectator to action rather than a continual participant. Plato was once asked his profession, and he replied that he was by nature and birth an observer. Now, in our way of living, growth is partly by observation. Education is partly by observation. This is the more true because modern education, scholastically speaking, is becoming less and less aware of the practical values of daily existence. Education is becoming more and more theoretical. To meet this, the individual must become conscious of the immediate challenge of situations. If we can take the position of an observer, we can gain experience from the conduct of others. We can be aware of the natural results of action without always having performed that action ourselves. But in order to be good observers, we must be able to be quiet. We must have the courage to refrain from becoming involved in every situation that arises. By detachment, we attain impartiality. And by this, in turn, we improve judgment. Because unless we can judge things fairly, we learn little from them. And we cannot judge anything fairly if we are involved in it. So the ability to remain detached is very valuable from an educational and cultural point of view. It gives us the skill to find out how things work and function without being forever in the middle of every emergency that arises. Thus, by relaxation, by sitting quietly, by not attempting to dominate every situation that comes along, by not rising in continuous exasperation because people disagree with us. We simply remain watchful. We will save ourselves considerable embarrassment also. Very often our own ill-timed interference merely exhibits our own ignorance or lack of thoughtfulness. So there are many advantages in a becoming modesty. On a psychological level, there is a considerable difference of opinion on these matters. Psychology does not like to consider the person as frustrating or limiting himself. This is the day of the great extroversion. And as a result, we're all neurotics. Because the more we feel we should extrovert, the more we resent any limitation, reasonable or unreasonable, upon ourselves. And people are regarding themselves as frustrated today, when under similar circumstances 25 years ago they would not have felt themselves frustrated, because they didn't know about the terms and did not consider the normal acceptance of responsibility as a frustration. If, therefore, in the psychological sense of the word, we must always be extroverting, then we must always be on a highly combative, objectifying relationship with life. This is a terrific exhaustion. Even if we are right, we do not always win. And usually we are wrong. Usually we are merely in these problems because we do not have sense enough to keep out of them. Whereas quietude would correct that situation and improve judgment. Following every impulse, we become annoyed at anyone who has an idea contrary to our own. We've got to battle it out with him. We've got to talk him down. And as he talks louder, we talk louder and try to shout him down. All of this produces nothing but common exhaustion. Nobody wins, because each person goes back to his own position, quite convinced that he is right. And the audience, whatever it may be, probably gains only the impression that all knowledge leads to argument, which is bad taste. No one is really any the better. To win by shouting is no victory. Consequently, our entire relationship is too aggressive, too objective, too egocentric to support the better aspects of our own nature. Actually, we are here to grow and to learn. We learn more by taking a receptive attitude toward life than by attempting constantly to force our own purposes upon life. Man today is creating a very difficult kind of world simply because he is demanding the right to make this world what he wants it to be. It has never occurred to him that his own selection could be wrong, that the kind of world that he is creating is a world fashioned by his own ignorance, and that he can never, by continuing his present process, achieve any of the better ends which he desires. And it is the same with personal conduct. The individual is not here merely to impose his own authority upon others. He is here to discover, if possible, the values which he knows he needs, and which he must discover whether he wishes to or not. Humility has been advised and recommended by nearly all of the great religious philosophies of the world. Religion has always emphasized a gentle way of life, a non-combative, non-argumentative approach to value. Today we are inclined to assume that this represents some kind of weakness. And we do not feel that in a world where we are all created free and equal, that we should be expected to toady to anybody. As long, of course, as we regard humility as toadying to something or someone, we have totally missed the meaning of the word. Humility is not a groveling state of condition. It is simply the natural attitude of a person who knows enough to know what he doesn't know. It is a situation in which our own internal realization censors an excessive attitude and brings us to a moderate position. While man is self-centered and egocentric, he can be very proud, very strong, and very aggressive. The moment he is thoughtful, he becomes less aggressive. The moment he begins to recognize the greatness of life and the insignificance of himself, he begins to get oriented in this world. Now, against this orientation is this collective psychic impression that we have today that the world is just waiting for us to move it. That anything we want to do, we can do. And that it is up to us to make the world into the fulfillment of our own desire. This might seem to be true, but the truth of the matter is that it is up to us to have the right desire in the first place, and that we do not have. And until we determine more accurately what kind of a world we ought to live in, it is not wise for us merely to exercise force, trying to make activity without purpose or reason or understanding or enlightenment. In religion, therefore, there is a certain renunciation of ego, which is perhaps the beginning of true humility. Humility begins in the relationship of the individual to the infinite. He cannot be dominant in this relationship. He cannot stand and overwhelm his universe with his own personality. Man is on the receptive end of practically every natural fact. He lives because of a universe that is wiser than he is. He survives upon the bounty of laws. He is not able to control these laws. He cannot create them. But he enjoys their benevolent action upon himself. He is supplied by an infinite diversity of resources available to him in nature. He does not create these resources. He merely is able to use them and adapt them to his own needs. He is in the presence of universal laws, so much vaster than himself that he cannot even comprehend them. And in the presence of such vastness and such universality, it is difficult for an intelligent person to take an attitude of aggressiveness or an attitude of egotism or self-assurance. On the other hand, we do not expect the individual to get down and grovel. He is also a being of value and significance. Somewhere in this relationship, among excessive attitudes, there has to be one of moderation. There has to be a golden mean. Man has to search for the fact about his place in life, that he is not in a dominating situation, nor is he utterly dominated. That somewhere between a divine state and a condition of insignificance, he stands with a measure of significance and a measure of insignificance. In comparison to lesser, he has come far. In comparison to greater, he has a long way to go. And somewhere in this middle distance is his proper position, a strong and yet dignified modesty, a constructive humility, a genuine realization of his true place in nature. Until man finds his true place, he cannot accomplish his proper adjustment with life. And we are all of us in varying degrees of adjustment or in varying degrees of lack of adjustment. In this world, it is quite possible that some shall accomplish a considerable amount in a particular field. We have outstanding scientists and philosophers and scholars. We have artists and musicians, craftsmen. These persons have a right to be proud of their attainments, and they naturally receive the applause of their fellow men. Man seemingly is perfectly willing to applaud achievement. And while some may be jealous, the majority is always ready to give its approbation for outstanding accomplishment. But the individual who has achieved in something is in a particularly perilous situation. He is apt to overlook the fact that there are so many things he has not achieved. In accepting applause and approbation, he may lose sight of his own weaknesses or fail to recognize the level upon which this applause has been given. Today we have quite a good deal of this type of situation where we find unusual rewards, publicity, recognition, honor bestowed upon persons whose accomplishments, while interesting and maybe meritorious, are not sufficiently outstanding to justify the adulation which they receive. It's quite possible that a good baseball player is an admirable person, but he is scarcely a proper object of universal veneration. The same may be true of a prize fighter or a jazz musician. He may have a very charming personality, but he could not and should not be elevated to the level of a public hero. He is not sufficiently endowed to maintain with dignity too great a degree of exaltation. Yet today we have a tendency to overdo our approbation of things not necessarily valuable, and to completely ignore that which is valuable and that which is necessary. If we thus spoil people, if we give them too much recognition for too little, we place them in an embarrassing and dangerous situation. We reduce their natural inclination to further improve themselves. If, therefore, adulation is poorly given, it simply means that we are rewarding unduly where the achievement does not properly justify such a reward. And when our friends reward us unduly, when they come to us for advice on something, or they say that we are quite helpful in this respect or in that respect, we have to be careful. For almost certainly, we are going to begin to overestimate ourselves. Having done one thing well, we regard ourselves as infallible. And if we do two things well, we become practically untouchable. Out of a fair degree of common sense, we can, by adulation, be completely blinded to every limitation that we have. This is especially true of persons in public life, and I have seen it happen remarkably in the fields of religion, philosophy, psychology, and things of that, levels of that kind. The individual cannot resist the corrosive effect of flattery. He so desires to be considered superior that he clings desperately to adulation that is not justified. There is no one so foolish but that he can have two disciples. But if he permits himself to be overwhelmed by the applause of these two disciples, he will remain foolish forever, and perhaps grow a little more foolish each day. It is far better for him to be challenged in some way than it is to simply be applauded. The only defense that the average person has against the approbation of others is his own recognition of his own limitation. If he is totally honest within himself, he will know to what degree he merits the applause of others and to what degree this applause is falsely given. But it is human nature for us to lose sight of our own limitations. And if enough people approve of us, we regard this as final proof that they are right. After we once become thus dominated by the sense of our own importance, actually life begins to lose most of its happiness, its value, its serenity for us. Out of our own sense of importance, we become self-appointed guardians of something. Sometimes we become self-appointed guardians of the whole universe. If we are more modest than that, perhaps we only become self-appointed guardians of families or friends or social circles. But certainly we overemphasize our own abilities of leadership. Very soon others object because they also would like to be guardians of something. And the battle of the guardians sets in. Friends no longer speak to each other. Families are broken up. Communities are torn apart. And human relationship, which should be a mutual effort at self-improvement, becomes a mutual program of tearing each other down. Each person trying desperately to maintain his own superiority, not by his conduct, but by argument. All these pressures are too destructive. They cost too much in terms of energy, especially in times like this, in which energy is at a premium. So in place of these attitudes, the one of rather simple acceptances is far less glamorous, perhaps, but more substantial. Actually, we are not here in this world to prove that we can run other people. We are here to prove that we can control and direct our own conduct. And I have watched very closely, and I have noted the lives of persons who really have accomplished a great deal in a serious kind of work. Nearly every person who is really outstanding in achievement has been a modest person, and usually far more willing to listen than to speak. In a meeting of celebrities, the truly outstanding one is usually the quietest one. Not only is he quiet by inclination, but because if he is earnestly a seeker after knowledge, he finds he knows more and learns more by keeping quiet. He is not trying to be modest. He simply has no inclination to be otherwise. False modesty is as unbecoming as arrogance. The person who becomes intelligent, or who gradually unfolds the understanding of his own life, comes almost certainly to the degree in which he finds a great need to further understand people. The great study for mankind is man. It is a very interesting and wonderful and pleasant occasion to go out in view of sunset, or to stand by the shore and watch the sun rise over the sea. These are stimulating. But the problem that always confronts the individual is trying to understand why his neighbor and his friend react as they do to the circumstances of living. Nearly all outstanding leaders have some kind of a ministry to perform. They are trying to contribute something to the common good. In order to contribute to man, it becomes increasingly necessary to understand man. Practically every humanitarian, every altruist, has finally come upon the rocks because of man. The human being is so complex, so involved, that every program that is conceived for his advancement founders because of man's own complex nature. There is no possible way of arbitrarily interpreting man. There's no way of creating a diagrammatic man. There's no way of saying this is true of man collectively. The moment we assume a collective attitude, in that moment we come across countless exceptions. We say that the human being wants to be better. We affirm this is true. And then we find individuals, and we come to realize that as far as their conscious actions are concerned, they do not want to become better. All they really want to do is to do what they please. So we take and impose upon man countless altruistic, idealistic motivations. We know they're there somewhere. We know that if we could examine 100 million people, a large percentage of these people would have those attitudes. But when we come face to face with a person, we cannot be sure whether he is one of those with those attitudes or not. Usually he is not. So the great problem always is to learn more about people. What we think of them is not as important as to find out what they are. No matter how often we impose our own definition upon someone else, we have achieved nothing, because that person still remains himself. Our big problem is to find out what that self is. We will never find that out by telling him. We must find it out by letting him tell us. Now, there's no use to ask him for a definition. He immediately will be placed upon the defensive, and he will proceed to outline every theoretical virtue that he possesses, claim to believe them, and then act in the contrary way. What we have to do is watch him when he does not know he is being watched. We have to sit back and study him. Not because we want to take him to pieces, but because we would like to put him together again. He is taking himself to pieces. So we have the privilege of becoming informed by watchful observation. We see how he reacts. If he's going to have an argument, we will let him have it with someone else. We will watch them both. Not because we want to criticize, not because we want to find out which one is right. Chances are they're both wrong. What we want to find out is why the human being acts as he does. How we may expect him to react to certain pressures. We want to find the way of getting facts to him with the least possible resistance on his own part. We want to encourage him to get the facts out of himself with the least hindrance on our part. In other words, we want to help that person to be better. The only way we can help him is to understand him. And the only way we can ever understand him is to keep quiet and observe how he acts. Thus, by keeping quiet, keeping out of the argument, we not only succeed in not making enemies, but we also begin to understand human beings better. If we have had a reasonably quiet life, if maybe by habit, we can enter into any throng of persons, and while socially acceptable, we can keep a relaxed and somewhat detached attitude toward all these persons. We will, over the course of a lifetime, get rid of a number of illusions that people have who have never been able to keep quiet and study anything. We will then discover that one of the reasons why leaders get into trouble is because they really have never taken the time to understand the people who are following them. They have never kept quiet. They have created imaginary worlds around them. They have decided what people are like. They have bestowed upon persons around them both virtues and vices, so exaggerated that there is little resemblance to reality. And because we then simply serve others according to our own opinions, the service is a failure. If, on the other hand, we studied, observed, watched, we would find out what other people are like and save ourselves many a broken heart. In order to do these things, in order to really understand life, then, we have to become receptive. And we cannot be receptive if we are forever aggressive. This process of breaking through all resistance on the great road of success may put a few dollars in the bank, but it will never bring us an intimate understanding of the world we're working with. It will never bring us an intimate understanding of our own families or of the immediate needs toward which we might like to dedicate our altruism. The same way with creeds and religions. Most persons who have religious prejudices have simply no knowledge, actually, of the thing against which they are holding a prejudice. They are merely attacking their own thought form. They are merely objecting to something that they themselves have created. All these procedures are due to a militant attitude, an overestimation of self. And as time goes on, we can see how this gradually leads to every kind of misfortune. Out of false values come the great disappointments of life. We believed someone We have dedicated ourselves to trying to help that person. We have sacrificed. We have given. We have labored. We have gone without. And all we ever got was ingratitude. It is a very unhappy, terrible thing. But if we had kept quiet in the first place and studied that other person, we would have known that ingratitude was all we could ever get by the procedure we were following. We could have saved ourselves this tremendous disappointment and disillusionment. We would have found out that the thing we were doing could never produce any other result. But instead of that, we built an imaginary friend with virtues and characteristics they never possessed. We expected them to appreciate, when had we studied them, we would have found out they could not. So having built a false person and sacrificed our lives for that false concept, we then blame the real person whom we have never understood. We consider that they have failed us, when in reality we are merely the victims of our own bad judgment. Also, had we recognized the facts, we might have changed our course of helpfulness, been truly helpful, and have gained the respect and recognition of this other person. But with our own mind locked on a formula of our own, and perfectly certain we knew enough to know what we were doing, we started out and did everything wrong from the beginning. Having gone along in this way until this error has become a dominant element in our entire personal conduct, we are no longer able to get out of it. We become a hopeless victim of our own bad judgment. Therefore, humility not only helps us to judge the value in ourselves, but it helps us to escape false values in others. Humility does not deny value in another person. But the moment we begin to realize that we are not perfect, we are also in a better position not to demand more from others than they can give us. And one of the great sorrows of life is always disillusionment, the failure of the other person to live up to our expectancy. If, however, we insist upon having fantastic expectancy, nothing else can ever happen but disillusionment. If we analyze that other person thoughtfully, we would not expect the impossible, but would discover perhaps the very deep and real charm of the possible. If we had not demanded too much, we might have been grateful for small things. If we had seen the capacity of this person fairly, we might be able to say that our relationship had helped them. Whereas in the terms of our attitude, it has only injured both ourselves and others. It's all a matter of false valuations. And most sorrow today is due to the individual's failure to analyze, failure to think, failure to feel normally about things. Every attitude and emotion that we have is pressured. It is exaggerated. It is toxic. It has lost reasonable boundaries. And because of its lack of organization, it threatens to turn on us any moment with a terrible discouragement or disillusionment. Against this, we have no defense, except to relax and stop pressing. Stop trying to force things. and recognize that it is not our power to make things happen. All we can do is to help reasonable things to happen. If we could imagine that our friend is like a seed planted in the earth, we did not give life to this seed. We cannot force it to grow, but we can be thoughtful. We can supply it those elements and conditions most suitable to growth, and then probably it will grow. But when it does grow, it will grow to be itself. And if we are wrong in deciding what that plant is going to be, the plant will prove that we are wrong, because it will not meet our requirement. Therefore, we must help these plants to be themselves. And if we plant a certain seed or find a certain plant, we cannot change it. We can perhaps help it to mature better. We can protect it from weeds. But if it starts out with a certain destiny and life, we cannot force that to change. Nor can we force other people to become what we want them to be. We have no right to try. The thing we can do, however, is help them to be their own most honorable, most reasonable, most enlightened selves. We can seek to release their potential. But to do this, we must discover their potential. And we cannot do this by talking all the time. We have to listen. We have to observe them. We have to permit their personality to move in upon us to the degree that we can analyze it, diagnose it, estimate it. If we are constantly tossing our personalities at them, we shall never find out who they are or what they are, unless it be to discover in the end that they become rather irritable about the whole thing. Thus, in learning, quietude is the most available means of discovering truth. Quietude means a relaxed relationship between the individual and the source of further information. Quietude does not simply mean sitting still with your fists clenched, your jaws tight, just trying not to break in and correct everybody else's mistakes. Relaxation is this quietude by means of which we are not just interested in mistakes, and we're not quite so sure we could cure them all. Rather, we would rather wait and see what we can find out from the depth of these other persons. Sometimes we learn what an individual thinks by listening to him advise a third person. We discover much about him because we have seen him drawn upon. To find out what other people really have to offer, we must draw upon those persons. We discover tremendous depths when others need us. We find that perhaps our advice and our understanding is fuller than we have ever suspected when someone else needs us. If, however, that other person comes and begins to tell us what they think, this experience of depth will never come in ourselves. Therefore, we give the other person the opportunity to naturally reveal himself if we give him a receptive relationship. And by this releasing him, we often solve his biggest problem by simply giving him an opportunity to talk about it, to tell us. And we take an attitude of receptive understanding. This has proved therapeutic in countless cases. We gain much more for him by listening to him than telling him. All these things point out laws operating in the psychic life of man. Laws that mean that by being quiet, we learn. And that this quietude must be sufficiently real so that we are not constantly on edge, with our minds and emotions really anxious to get into the fight and just being held back by willpower. We've got to really relax. We've got to get through all the artificial levels and try to determine what the values are in basic patterns. Sometimes we have to coax this out of other people. Certainly we can never force it from them. And while we can perhaps create a belligerent situation so that they forget themselves and become angry and tell us what they think, this again is not truthful in the finest sense of the word. The angry person does not tell the truth. What he tells is his own immediate attitude. He will not dissemble how he feels. He will not say he likes you when he is angry at you. He will tell you what he thinks and what he feels at the moment. But these things are not truth, because they rise from a pressured state of himself and may be completely contrary to his own attitudes when he is relaxed. Same is true of ourselves. Anything we do under pressure is not the expression of our truest, deepest truth nature. We have to dig into this and get beneath these pressures. Now, a person who is humble, we'll say, is he going to be turned into a doormat by other people? Are we going to walk on his rights and privileges? Are we going to ignore him? Are we going to leave him far behind in the way of life? Is he going to suffer and be variously deprived of his rights because he doesn't want to get up all the time and fight for something? Most people are not fighting for their rights in the first place. They're fighting to defend their wrongs. The average person must recognize what philosophy taught in the beginning, namely that truth requires no defense and error can never be successfully defended. Where we have to get up and fight for things, those things themselves are not understood or essentially true in ourselves. It is perfectly possible for the individual to be humble, to be quiet, and still be strong. He is not a doormat. He may not be willing to become involved in an argument. He may refrain and hold the right to keep his own counsel, but this does not mean that he has no counsel. It means that he does not wish to waste energy and life fighting on issues which will never be clarified by conflict, now or any other time. Consequently, if the person who is quiet has strength within himself, this strength will not be lost, nor will he be ready to be imposed upon. Because he keeps his own counsel, he has a perfect right to his own conviction, particularly as he has so trained himself that this conviction is of no injury to anyone else. He need not apologize, nor back down, because he keeps his own counsel. He simply does not intend to go around wasting time and energy arguing about imponderables that will never be solved by any form of argument. Gradually, I have observed that these quieter persons are not regarded as weak. depending. Sometimes, of course, the individual is only quiet because he is weak. He says nothing because he is speechless. Well, of course, this is not a valuable state of existence. But where the person has control, has self-discipline, he is stronger than anyone who lacks it. And self-discipline may impel him to exercise self-control. The American people lacking discipline would do well to cultivate some of it and reveal this cultivation through their ability to keep out of situations that are profitless. In religious mysticism and so on, in all these fields, it has been demonstrated from the beginning that humility is an absolutely important mystical attainment. Because humility seemingly creates a kind of internal receptivity by means of which of spiritual value descending from the internal life of things becomes knowable and can be experienced by the individual. Any individual who is aggressive in his relationship to his own internal life cannot have this rapport with spiritual value. Aggressiveness is a motion outward. Aggressiveness has some recognition and some reward in the outward life of man. But the journey inward is always a journey to quietude, to peace, to calmness, to acceptances. Man may defy the world, but he must accept God. Man may go out belligerently to conquer outward circumstances, but he can never conquer internals by an aggressive procedure. Actually, he must always be conquered by internals. For that which is behind and within is greater than that which is upon the surface. The surface cannot conquer it. It must be permitted to conquer surfaces by its own depths and give us, therefore, a balanced and complete orientation. In all religion, unworldliness, detachment from things, detachment from pride, arrogance, a humble relationship toward situations, all this has been advocated, as in the case of Zen in Japan and China. Many of these old monks are said to have attained great length of life, and their formula has been a very simple one. Mind your own business. Well, that depends on what your own business is. Mind your own business in this case means stop interfering with other people. To interfere with another person is to cause him to do something that he does not want to do. It may cause him, or you may hope you will cause him, not to do something that he should not do. But also this is a questionable virtue. It may well be that his own total spiritual need requires that he should make a profound mistake at that moment. Prevent him from making it, and you have prevented him from growing. You have frustrated the need, because every time we force an attitude upon another person, we are depriving him of the right of earning it. So the Zen monk, by minding your own business, takes the simple attitude that he is available to the person who needs him, who wants him, who values him, Or he may come along behind with a basket to pick up the scraps of the mistakes we make. Help us in those moments in which we suddenly realize our errors and become modest, at least for a few seconds. But do not interfere. The Zen monk, by not interfering, remains in a relaxed state. Because there is no tension in him, he is not sick. Because he is not sick, he does not treat other people badly. Because the moment sickness arises in us, we are harder to get along with. Because we have neither tension nor stress, if we have this internal poise and relaxation, we are better friends, better neighbors, better relations, setting examples which give other people an opportunity to be themselves. If we are in a state of eternal tension, others around us cannot relax, or at least do not know that they can. And because of this, their own internal life is weakened according to the belligerence of our natures. There is this important power problem of man escaping from this westernized belief that we've got to prove that we're important by dominating something. Actually, the things in life which are real cannot be dominated. And anything that we can dominate is as stupid as we are. Therefore, there is very little true glory to be gained by ruling over a world of people who themselves lack intelligence. A wise world we could not rule, because it will never permit us to. And a foolish world is not worth ruling. But we break ourselves to pieces and drive ourselves crazy trying to do it. Always assuming that we have some peculiar attribute or virtue which others have lacked, by which we can accomplish that at which they have failed. On the devotional side of life, modesty or humility opens a deep and wonderful rapport between ourselves and everything internally valuable. Aggressiveness is a brittleness which cannot be truly friendly, truly kind, truly beautiful, and truly good. Actually, everything that we do should be motivated by value. And the only value that we can really find is the value that comes through to us out of the quietude of our own consciousness. We should be moved from the total internal of ourselves. That is, our conduct, particularly when we wish to be humanitarian or idealistic or philanthropic, all these qualities should be moved from the richness, the fullness of our total capacity. To move from total capacity means that every internal available value must be within our reach. We must be doing what we are doing from the highest level of motivation that we know. All ulterior motive should be clearly kept out of the situation. And in order to standardize what virtue we do possess, in order to call upon the full resource of our internal, we must do so while our inner life is in the condition to testify most completely. This means that we must move from an absolute quietude inside of ourselves. The moment we are agitated for woe or weal, value is lost. The moment we become tense, we become untruthful. We cannot help it. We are not able to use our full availability if we interfere with it. And the moment self-purpose and self-will manifest, universal purpose and divine will cease to operate. If then a good deed is to be done, it must be done from the goodness in us. We must try to understand and become so impersonal and so impartial that that good deed is totally honest. If it is as totally honest as we can make it, truly so, it is not common for this good deed to cause a tragedy. We are not likely to be hurt by a good deed that is truly arising from the total virtue of ourselves. What we do is to suffer from a so-called good deed, which is backed by a variety of motives, some good and others ulterior, which we have not analyzed and not considered properly because we were too mentally or emotionally involved. Therefore, we could not be honest. To keep this ulterior motive out of it, we have to be in a condition to constantly examine ourselves. When we turn in for such examination, we become defensive. The individual does not want his motives to be that carefully analyzed because he's not sure of them himself. In fact, he is pretty sure that there are some very ulterior ones locked in there somewhere. But he justifies them on the grounds that other people have them too. That it's fine for him to do a good deed, but it is also very good for him to be rewarded for it. Especially if the reward is a little more than his own virtue. That is profit. And after all, we are entitled to 6% on any investment. By the time we get through analyzing the motive behind our good deed, it can be as involved and complicated as our Christmas present, which we wait till the very last moment to send in the hope we'll get the gift the other person is going to send us first so we can figure out whether it balances economically. We don't want to take a chance on giving more than we get. Now, all these ulterior motives are instinctive. We don't realize them. This one we might. It's pretty obvious if we thought a little. But there are all kinds of deep ones. Why should not our children do this and that? Look what we've done for them. Have we not a right to be unhappy when they neglect us? Have we not a right to feel that we are entitled to consideration when we have given it? And so with our rights and our wrongs, we get all locked into things. And by the time we're through with trying to find out what is just, what is right, what is equitable, all the beauty's gone. And what was beautiful might have also been a very important basic question, but we never got around to that. What the individual has to ultimately learn is that the great reward for everything that he does is the simple fact that he does it. And that when he gives expression to the most unselfish of his own attitudes, he is doing himself the greatest possible favor. What other people do about it is not important. The important thing is his own motive in doing it. Unless he is quiet, how will he ever find out what his motive was? Because his thoughts and his emotions will talk him in and out of motives so rapidly that he will never be able to evaluate them. When his emotions tell him he's been wronged, what is right no longer appears in the picture anywhere. When his mind tells him that he has been tricked or deceived, value is lost. He becomes an instrument of revenge. He becomes an instrument of returning ill for ill and feels perfectly justified in doing so. He has not the capacity to accept these things into his consciousness, pass them through his own consciousness, and transmute them again. It is only in quietude that man can transmute the things that are done to him and gain a new insight into value. It is not to toss these things back. That is what causes war. War is nothing but an individual or group of individuals taking a bad deed and tossing it back and forth among themselves forever. And each time it is tossed, there are further hatreds, there are further animosities, and the great tradition of destruction is lengthened and deepened. The individual who is receptive and quiet can accept a great deal of tension and stress into himself, transform it, let it die there, so that it never comes to life again. He therefore can end situations, whereas if he has no quietude in himself, he merely perpetuates them. In all our relationships, therefore, we are told from our sacred writings, from such wonderful sermons as the Sermon on the Mount, and of the first great discourse of Buddha, and Muhammad's sermon at Mecca, we are told in all of these great works the tremendous importance of being humble, of being quiet, of being gentle, of accepting into ourselves, of returning good for evil. And yet as we go on through life, we begin to question the validity of these scriptural admonitions. We see what seems to be a world in which the living of a quiet, gentle life is almost impossible. We seem to recognize that the tremendous competition of the times means that we have to become aggressive, unpleasant people. Actually, this is not true at all. The only reason why we are aggressive and unpleasant is because we have not yet overcome these qualities. They have been ours from the beginning. We never get over them until we do something about them. But like most weaknesses of character, it is easier, apparently, to perpetuate them than to correct them. Actually, our success in life, our ability to hold our heads up, these things have nothing to do with our power to relax within ourselves. We have about 10,000 years of at least sketchy history to look back over. At least 4,000 or 5,000 years of that history is fairly clear. In all this history, we have seen one group of factors continuously operating, and out of this operation, nothing but disaster. We have seen human beings hating from the beginning of history, and the only thing this hate has ever produced is destruction. We have seen valiant individuals, a few, standing up and reminding man that he cannot afford to hate. We have rewarded those individuals with death and misery, but we have never proved them to be wrong. And wherever we have practiced their recommendation, life has become better. Yet in spite of this, we continue to encourage the negatives, we continue to sow the dragon's teeth, and we continue to raise a harvest of warriors. We have not accepted the evidence of history or the experience of our race. We have continued on our own negative course. Yet the fact that we continue does not make it right, and the individual of today will gain no more comfort out of it than the days that were gone by found comfort or understanding in similar procedures. It has nothing to do with our security. Lack of humility contributes to our insecurity because it causes us to live alone on the surface of our own lives, the weakest place we can live. It cuts away from us every internal resource because we have become self-satisfied and self-sufficient when nothing in nature is truly self-sufficient. All things for their sufficiency depend upon value greater than themselves. And man, recognizing value and relaxing to it, has this value available to him to use. But as long as he thinks he is sufficient to his own needs, he denies this larger value and locks his consciousness against it. He does not become strong by denying value, but by learning to obey it. For that reason, every religion has placed upon man some concept of discipline. And discipline in most cases is obedience. And obedience is a kind of humility which we resent. We do not want to obey anything, but we must obey something. If we do not obey the laws of the universe, we must obey the moral and ethical principles of our own convictions. We must obey. For in lawlessness we create only strife and discord. Through relaxation, through quietude, through the gradual acceptance of the importance of universals, obedience becomes not a problem, not a burden, not a frustration, but a simple form of worship. Therefore, humility is worship. Humility is the individual knowing that which is superior and acknowledging it graciously, acknowledging it as the child acknowledges the greater strength or power of parent, not actually, grudgingly, not because we cannot deny this greater strength, but because it is part of a natural value. We enjoy it, we share it together. And there is no real conflict between the strength of the parent and the need of the child. The moment that conflict enters, it is artificial. But we are all dependent upon one life, one eternal value, and to this all knees must bend, and we must accept it. And the rich life is a life of rich acceptances, of gracious receivings. And even in this, in our daily living, we find our weakness. We all like to do nice things for people. We are all embarrassed if they do anything for us. Thus we are not gracious in our receiving, because it seems to indicate that we are weak when others serve us. It seems to indicate that we are strong when we serve them. Actually, it must always indicate that we are truly strong when we can graciously receive. It takes much more courage to obey than it does to command. Yet no one is fit to command who has not learned to obey. And in quietude, we learn to obey the divine. We learn the strength that comes in humility, in gentleness, in humbleness of spirit. We find what it means to bow down to that which is and is alone the cause of our good. We learn to be servants of principles instead of dictators over men. It is far more important to serve that which is true than to command that which is untrue. Our greatest strength is our ability to sacrifice all things in the service of those gentle, simple principles which are the roots of our existence. So we may have to put up a certain front to the world. We overdo it, however. But we cannot put up a front to our own internal. In the presence of ourselves, we have to acknowledge our weaknesses, our ineptitudes, and our inabilities. And entering into the sanctum sanctorum, or the holy place of our lives, we must bend in simple, gracious acceptance of the infinite, of the spiritual strength upon which we demand and depend, the source of our life and our light. There is no use shaking our fist at the heavens, nor is there any use in assuming that we can command the sun. It is far better to realize that these great powers invite our loving use, invite our sharing, and invite that we should so reverence and honor greatness that we will use it wisely and truthfully. It is far more important for us to thus become the conscientious servants of work needing to be done, work that must be done if our world is to grow. Perhaps we have not defined humility as some people would think of it, because the term essentially is a religious term. We say a person is of humble station. This means that humbleness generally represents a social term of one of negative attainments, one who has not grown beyond a certain point, either economically, politically, or socially. But humility and humbleness are not the same thing. Humility is not even man's attitude in the presence of a king. The king may demand that his servant or subject be humble. But humility is a term curiously reserved for spiritual value. Man should not humble himself before God, but he should approach God with humility. Humility implies not an inferior social state. Humility implies perhaps social equality, but that the individual recognizes the superiority of value. Therefore, it is not good for a father to humble his son. But it is good that man should with humility approach truth, because now he is approaching value, and he is admitting that he does not possess this value, or he would not need it, that in some way he must be on the receiving end of value, and that by humility he opens himself to value. Therefore, we should not humble people. We should not make people eat humble pie, regardless of how we feel about them. For humbleness, if forced upon man, is just as bad as arrogance. We do, however, seek that the individual shall attain for himself, not because it is forced upon him by another, but shall attain for himself humility toward value. Thus, humility is again no longer something forced upon us, but a voluntary recognition of the superiority of things greater than ourselves. And this greatness must be in term of value, not in term of prestige or worldly goods. or wealth or authority, but greatness in terms of spiritual moral content. Thus, perhaps, we can have humility in the presence of a good person, but we can only be humble in the presence of a strong person. Thus, and before the dictator, we must humble ourselves. But only before truth can we attain a self-determined humility. A humility that tells us what our proper etiquette is in the presence of that which is true. Because it is only by this receptivity that we open ourselves to share this greater thing. The person who is humble simply bends to inevitables. He is a slave. But humility opens us to become like that which is good. Humility is a statement of need, therefore, not a statement of servitude. The individual who has humility is acknowledging that he needs, and the thing that he always must need is the presence of God. Therefore, he in his humbleness may only be accepting eye service from a tyrant, but in his humility he is admitting that he needs the presence of truth, and that he acknowledges this need, and in acknowledging opens himself to receive. So humility is opening oneself to receive that which is superior, where humbleness is only accepting the lashes of despotism. So no man need to be humble in that sense of the word. But humility is man's worship of that which is better than himself, more abundant, more perfect, wiser. And in this very humility is his own statement that he wishes to be like this better thing. Therefore, he is open to its instruction. He is open to its impact. He is open to its value in himself. And therefore he has said that between truth and himself there shall exist a state of peace. He has declared peace with that which is truly greater. He will no longer compete. They will no longer struggle, but will accept, and accept with gratitude. Thus, this type of humility nearly always presages the mystical experience. It is present in those in whose lives a great and beautiful extension of consciousness is likely. For it is in this simple acceptance of the virtue and power of the greater good that the individual, opening himself totally, receives totally. And being filled with this totality, suddenly discovers the tremendous dynamic of his own humility. For the more of deity is present in man, the less arrogant that man is. You would think that the person who has had a great mystical experience and an impact of tremendous spiritual consciousness would then perhaps have the true right to be a little arrogant, a true right to feel superiority. But this is never the case. It is present only where the experience is false. For as man receives the real and true impact of universal upon himself, his humbleness perhaps is changed, but his humility is deepened. He becomes ever more aware of the total sublimity of things. he becomes more completely certain that he is indeed the pen in the hand of the ready writer. His magnificent recognition of the sublime value of existence deepens, and he becomes more and more totally aware of how little he is in comparison to the vastness of the good, the beauty, and the truth which he has come to apperceive. So the true mystical experience leaves those who have it with a strange and continuous humility, a humility that is not false, a humility now that is so full of gratitude that the individual can never be proud because he is forever grateful. And out of these gentler emotions come the values and virtues which help us on our way to a fuller experience of truth as eternal strength. Strength because it makes us forever patient, gives us forever humility, and crowns our life with eternal gratitude. In these values there is a strength which is sufficient at all times and for all things. Well, time's up.